So what happens is the dopaminergic reinforcement produced by the drug reinforces that nihilistic hopelessness that drives the behavior.
That's right.
And that's how, in part, you develop a monkey on your back.
Yeah, I love the example, even though I'm sad that it happens for people. I love the example because what you're saying is that, and it's exactly right, that the memory for events and states of mind and emotions that preceded a successful collection of reward or arrival at reward is set into a huge number of motor commands, some of which are subconscious. And the ultimate dopamine signal, actually, I experienced this the other day. I can give an example. My girlfriend and I decided to go to the beach. We were going to go do this little ritual that we've been talking about doing for a while. And I had on a piece of paper what we had written out we were going to do. And I had it in my back pocket. And we got to the ocean and the sun was setting. It was sort of perfect timing for this. And the piece of paper was gone. And I thought, oh my goodness, how did I screw this up? Like, of all the things, I'm supposed to, I'm 47 years old. This is not like I should be able to do this. Get
your
I
act
blew it.
Yeah,
I blew it. So I went back to the car, long walk, looking everywhere. It was not a windy day, but I thought, gosh, where's this piece of paper? Looking around, didn't find it. Went all the way back to the car. Was in the car. Came all the way back, and I was walking toward her. I saw her, and I thought, okay, this is really embarrassing. I'm gonna just have to wing it or remember. We didn't have our phones intentionally either, so we couldn't look it up. And then I saw the piece of paper on the beach. And it was partially buried in the sand. I picked it up and I was elated. What happened there was my dopamine had dropped way below baseline because I was disappointed that I'd lost it, disappointed in myself, et cetera. And then I found it. And so
your action was for nothing.
Exactly.
So you got punished by yourself for that.
Exactly.
Because that should be eradicated. If you're highly anticipatory and it doesn't make itself manifest, then you were seriously wrong. You're going to take a emotional hit as a consequence of that. I think that's also associated, that emotional hit, that pain that you feel, I think that's actually associated with the beginning stages of the death of the systems that mediated that initial response. Because you should eradicate systems that make you anticipate that don't work, right? And that means those systems, which are already instantiated and alive in some sense, have to decay and die. And it strikes me as highly probable that you're going to pay a price in something approximating pain for the death of those malfunctioning systems. It's also because why wouldn't they fight for their lives to some degree? Why wouldn't they resist the decay and death that might be necessary to keep you going? Why? There should be some pain associated with that logically, because it is a biological transformation.
It's an interesting a lens to view it through, that self image that I had in that moment of, I'm the responsible partner who can take care of a simple thing, right? For this nice little ritual that we'd been talking about doing for a while. I failed, right?
Well, it's also so interesting. You think about that. This is a depressive cascade, and it's very hard to bind, because imagine you anticipate something and then you make a mistake. Now, the question then becomes, how significant is the mistake? And one view of your error would be, well, the paper blew out of my pocket and that could happen to anybody. And the more catastrophic interpretation would be, and it's an extension of the thought path that you started to walk down, well, I'm near 50 years old, I should be much more responsible than this, and there's something wrong with me and then a depressive person would go even further. They'd say, well, not only is there something wrong with me in this decision, this is a decision like every other decision I make right now. I never make a good decision. In the past, I've never made a good decision, and there's no way I'm going to change in the future. And so the depressive takes that punishment response, let's say, that's a consequence of failed anticipation, and can't bind it. It just takes out all of their potential future selves. That's a good way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
And so then they're in a depressive.
Yeah.
So that's too much learning from failure.
Right. I'm grateful for your insight on this, because indeed, if I'm honest, my thought train went to the point of, I didn't think, I'm a total failure because I lost this piece of paper. I thought to myself, well, if it were a priority, I wouldn't have lost it.
Right.
She'll interpret it as not being a priority. Like, where are my priorities? Am I overspent? What's going on? You start to sift into the full set of questions. And then, of course, finding the paper resurrects the sense of self. It was, in that movie, Pulp Fiction.
Yeah, well, that binding problem is really tricky, because there's some good rules of thumb for that, which is, one of the rules of thumb for that's extremely useful, that's socially instantiated, is innocent until proven guilty. Right? So you might say, when those thoughts come up, because they're adversarial and accusatory thoughts, you might say, well, that is part of the realm of possibility, but I shouldn't. When your child does something wrong that's minor, you don't say you're a rotten kid, right? You say, you bind it. You say, look, kid, here's a bunch of things you're doing right. But in this particular example, specific situation, here's the minimal thing you did incorrectly and how to alter it. And it's a really good habit of mind. It's like to address towards yourself as well as to other people, which is to say, well, what's the minimum crime that I'm responsible for in this moment? And that's part of this miracle of the presumption of innocence, and especially without proof. And a lot of what I did in my clinical practice to people who had a depressive temperament was help them make a case for themselves. It's like, well, maybe you're as bad as you think you might be, but maybe not. Let's take the contrary argument. Let's make you as innocent as you can be in this situation and only narrow the repair to the absolute minimum that needs to be manifested. Now, some people don't have that problem because they don't have a depressive state of mind, let's say. They're somewhat resilient to the cascading effects of punishment. Those are people who are low in trait neuroticism, by the way. So you could think of trait neuroticism as an index to which the degree failure co-activates punishment across a whole sequence of nested selves. The higher you are in neuroticism, the more likely a given error is to a cascade up the hierarchy of possible selves. And it's a trade-off, because sometimes when you make one little mistake, it is actually an indicator of a flaw in your character. But most of the time it isn't. And it certainly can't be responded to that all the time, because then you'd never be able to make a mistake without wiping yourself completely out. And that's obviously not helpful.
Is it fair to say that, at least in the raising of children, maybe in the raising of ourselves, that we should, as much as possible, try and emphasize that errors are just state, not trait?
Yes, absolutely. And you do that in an argument with your wife as well. You want to make it as local and precise as you possibly can. So, and that's also one of the advantages to removing yourself from a rage or an anxiety state, because a rage or an anxiety state is low resolution and global. And so it'll be globally accusatory. And so you want to specify it and think, okay, well, what's the minimum necessary behavioral transformation to ensure that similar mistakes are not replicated in the future? And generally that doesn't require it's like if your roof leaks, you don't have to dig a new foundation. You can just fix a few shingles. And you might think, well, the rain's coming through, so you have to tear down the whole house. It's like, well, no, you have to. And you might panic and run around because the water's coming in, but it's still a bad idea to dig up the foundations every time something trivial maintenance problem needs to emerge. And so one of the things that's very useful to learn is like, well, is this only a trivial maintenance problem? And one of the advantages to that too is that if it's not the collapse of your entire self, let's say, and it's a trivial maintenance problem, you're much more able to activate that courageous response to anomaly that's part and parcel of exploratory behavior and eventual success. So, and part of the trick of many sorts of well, I would say religious training enterprises, certainly the meditative enterprises, is something like, how do you tell yourself a story, like a real story, though, a story that actually works, that's most likely to put yourself in a position where you can confidently approach the thing that's blocking your path.
This notion, you brought up 3 points that I think immediately of the related neurology, but I'm going to repeat them back to make sure I understand, because they're very salient in my mind right now, which is this notion of the prefrontal cortex trying different versions of self and working with, contending with bodily states in those moments, mm-hmm. And the sort of either death or growth or resurrection of those different selves, depending on the outcomes.
Right.
The next, this notion of state or trait, I find fascinating. After I found that piece of paper, I felt like I was like the greatest. I got this huge dopamine surge because it's the delta, it's the difference between your baseline and the peak.
Yeah, right.
So even though I'd lost it, right? I mean, I should have thought, oh gosh, I wasted 30 minutes of our time. But instead, I thought, I found this amazing, and I felt so elated. I think it was the movie Pulp Fiction. I think it was the John Travolta character said something. I'm going to get this wrong, but he said it was almost worth losing that just to find it again. He was talking about something. I forget what it was.
Right.
And I think that captured it there as well. And then my question is, however, we've been talking about if you lose something or if an outcome was not great, how that can fan out into a kind of overinterpretation of trait and this kind of depressive neurotic interpretation. What about the opposite, where certainly for every success that one has, like for instance, if I had not dropped this piece of paper, I wouldn't have thought of it as a great success. I would have just thought of it as what I was required to do in that moment, right? It was sort of just duty, right? And I'm not somebody who celebrates with everything I check off my list. Sometimes, yes, there are bigger things than others, bigger achievements than others. But I can that certain people might overinflate their wins.
Manics
overinflate. When there it is, the dopamine system.
Well, for a manic, every possible self is wonderful. And so they're completely fragmented, right? Because every possibility is 100% dopaminergically, giving them a dopaminergic kick. And so it's complete positive emotion catastrophe on the manic side. So these systems, they have to exist in such tight balance, right? Because all of your potential positive selves are not to be regarded with exceptional enthusiasm. That's a form of pathology, even though people don't like being treated for mania often, because especially going into a manic state is very enjoyable because it is associated with enthusiasm. And that's all dopamine-mediated positive emotion. But there are problems with positive emotion. And one is, it needs to be judicious and differentiated. You shouldn't be positive about everything, which is why you shouldn't reward children indiscriminately. It has to be targeted. And so when a system loses its focus and target, its capacity to discriminate, then it becomes pathological. And people don't often think of pathologies of positive emotion, but mania is that's definitely what it is. And it makes people impulsive too. And fragmented even in their speech. Like someone who's really manic is a different person every sentence.
It's interesting because one thing that we know, again, about the dopamine system, it's about anticipation. The other thing that is absolutely clear about the dopamine system is that it is tacked to pursuit more than it is to outcomes, but it is highly subjective to interpretation. And this is exciting, actually, and holds great possibility. I mean, putting mania aside, when dopamine is elevated, it tends to put our perception to things outside of I would say beyond the confines of our skin. That person, that potential lover or mate, that food, that reward, that thing.
That target.
It's all about target. And I think this explains why manics are all about plans and the future. I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that, and et cetera.
You see the opposite in neuroticism, because one of the cognitive phenomena that loads very heavily on neuroticism is self-consciousness. And so when you fall into anxiety, then there is this internal obsessiveness, which has to do with the panoply of sins in some sense. Which parts of me are malfunctioning and need to be eradicated? And one of the things I used to do with my socially anxious clients, so they would go into a social situation, often with eyes downcast, by the way, and they would be so intensely concentrating on their own internal sensations that they would fail to make eye contact with anybody they were talking to. And then they would be awkward because they weren't reading the cues they could have read if they would have only looked. And then the conversation would become disjointed. And then they would get anxious and fall into themselves, and then it would just spiral.
I see.
And so one of the things that I taught them to do wasn't to try to calm themselves down, but to try to calm the other person down. So when you go into a social situation, pay more attention to the other person. Like just focus your attention outward. And if the person had any social skill, sometimes I had clients who had no social skills. And so they were anxious socially because they actually didn't know how to behave socially. So then you had to teach them the social skills. But some of them had the skills but wouldn't activate them because they were so neurotically obsessed with their own inadequacy that they failed to attend to the cues that would elicit the proper responses. And all they had to learn to do was watch. And then they would automatically respond because they knew how to have a conversation.
This brings us to some of the practical tools that I think my laboratory has been working on, which is, many people have heard about the utility of mindfulness meditation, which most typically is close your eyes, focus on third eye center or your breathing, bring your awareness to your so-called interoception. Perception can be interoceptive from the skin inward or exteroceptive to the world outward. The data are showing that people who are overly socially anxious, for instance, they are too much in touch with their bodily signals. In fact, they can count their own heartbeats without taking their pulse with their finger, which is a is a great indicator of how interoceptively aware you are. Those people would probably be best to avoid inward focusing, meditation.
Well, it's hard to say, because there may be a variable there that's relevant. See, the reason that socially anxious people are so interoceptive is it's involuntary. Right? They get gripped by the negative emotion, and then that produces this intense, obsessive interoception. That might not happen if they did it voluntarily.
I see.
Because you're going to activate an entire different system, the one you already talked about. This is why exposure therapy works so well in psychotherapy, is like, well, I'm afraid of something, and if I go near it, then I'm possessed by negative emotion. Well, that's if you go near it accidentally. I'm going to have you go near it purposefully. And what you're going to find is that to the degree that you do it purposefully, that response will be quelled. And that happens. It's extraordinarily reliable. And it does seem to be, this is why I was wondering about gene expression. So imagine that you have someone who's habitually avoidant. And maybe they're avoidant because when they become possessed by negative emotion, they become hyper aware of their internal state and they feel the panic. And so then they freeze or retreat. And they do that constantly. And then they're in this terrible negative emotional state all the time, because every time they see a stimulus that's associated with retreat, they get gripped by these interoceptive sensations. And so you say to them, well, we're going to reverse that. Instead of you being gripped by that, by fiat, by the command of these underlying systems, you're going to expose yourself to that voluntarily. Now, you could imagine that what you're doing is imposing the dominance of that nucleus reunions on the anxiety-provoking systems. And so I'm wondering, see, if you do that repeatedly with people, not only do they stop being afraid of the things that you're showing them, that you're exposing them to, but they become more likely to approach other things they're afraid of, far more likely. In fact, it doesn't exactly look like people get less afraid at all. It looks like what happens is they learn to get braver, and that generalizes. And so I was wondering, when I was reading your research today, is it the case that if you put someone in chronically and voluntarily into a state where, let's say, the nucleus reunions is activated, that transforms their character at the genetic level so that that's more likely to be the case in the future? So it really retools them all the way down to the DNA.
Incredibly important question. It's the question. Again, you're asking the exact questions that we're pursuing now. And here's the answer. There are two modes of changing these responses in the neural circuitry. One lies in so-called neuroplasticity, which is could be strengthening of synapses or just reordering of nerve connections. Could be the addition of new cells. There's a lot of excitement about the addition of new neurons, but really that only reflects a small percentage of changes in the brain of adults. It's actually more the rewiring of existing connections, but the mechanism doesn't matter so much. Something gets rewired such that the response is then different going forward. And indeed, that happens. Any system that taps into the dopamine system, and indeed, everything we're talking about today does, is highly subject to reward-induced neuroplasticity.
Yeah.
In fact, so much so that some of the best experiments done on this have shown that if you give somebody a drug that transiently increases dopamine, works better if you also transiently increase acetylcholine or something like that as well. But for the next hours, 1 to 4 hours, the neuroplasticity is scaled up, right? It takes many fewer trials or many fewer cognitive behavioral therapy sessions. This has only been done a few times, or many fewer learning sessions to create a permanent shift in the neurology such that...
So does that mean that if you believe when you are at the outset of a task that you're doing something important, so you're approaching a valued goal, and you have a lot of anticipation as a consequence of that, does that mean that you put yourself in a neural that facilitates learning?
Absolutely, without question.
So if you believe what you're doing is important, if you truly believe that because it's related to an important goal and it's a pathway forward, then that's going to transform into a manifestation of...
Absolutely. And every time I hear about the sort of, woo statements about, I don't want to offend anyone here, but sure, I'll just say, you hear about the secret or manifesting or intention, all of that is really, it's capturing a fundamental principle of the way that our neurology works, which is the prefrontal cortex as a rule setting, but flexible rule setting machine that taps into the dopamine system can absolutely adopt new rules for reward release in the brain. Again, there's basically only one reward system. There's also serotonin system, as you know, but the dopamine system is the major currency of reward. So much so that, for instance, everyone knows that food is rewarding. We anticipate food. We eat a delicious steak or something, and we feel rewarded. However, if you are somebody who can attach thoughts such as, fasting is good for me, I'm going to do intermittent fasting, or I'm not going to eat those foods, and therefore I'm going to attach my thinking to the rewards that will come with better health, aesthetics, etc. The dopamine system responds. It's not just a belief in a narrative. It's a real response. And what starts to happen is that people start to enjoy the foods that they are restricting themselves to more. There are actually beautiful data on this from my colleague Ali Crum's laboratory at Stanford, that if you believe a food is nutritious and good for you, it actually has better impact on your physiology. Of course, there are the rules of physiology and nutrition that still apply, right? You can't tell yourself that the garbage is good for you, right? But there's a significant scaling up of the positive response that's associated with dopamine and hormonal cascades, which we can talk about in a moment. In the same way, if one adopts a sort of a Carol Dweckian growth mindset approach, okay, it's not about receiving the reward, that the more strain I feel, the more effort that I'm putting in, the closer I'm getting to my goal, that over time will become a rewarding state such that one will pursue states of reaching.
Yeah, well, it should be also proportional to the magnitude of the goal.
That's right.
Right. And so this is, I think, why people are so obsessed in some sense with the search for fundamental meaning, because you want to be able to associate. So imagine, this is a good story. So you can imagine two people laying bricks. They're building a gigantic wall, and the one person thinks, oh my God, this wall is going to take 100,000 bricks, and I'm laying one at a time, and I'm wasting my life away trivially adding to this gigantic brick wall. And what am I doing? This is absolutely miserable, brick by brick. And the other person thinks, in 300 years, this is going to be a cathedral. And so the person in the second state is doing exactly the same thing at a local level, laying bricks, but each brick is related to a very high goal. And that means the reward that's attendant upon the laying of the brick is proportional to the goal, to the aim of the behavioral process. And so it seems to me, so if you're aimless and goalless, and I know you've done some work on goal setting, if you're aimless and goalless, then you can't elicit any positive emotion. And if your goals are fragmented, which is also what happens if you're aimless or your goals lack unity, if your goals are fragmented, then no given behavioral manifestation can elicit any dopaminergic reward because it's not a step forward to anything desirable. And so there's no positive emotion. And so you can't learn. Well, according to your account, I didn't know that. See, I didn't know that when you put yourself in a state of apprehension in relationship to a valued goal, that your neuroplasticity improves and you can learn better. That's very, very cool. So, because I just developed this app for writing called Essay, and one of the things we do is we tell people that when they sit down to write an essay, that's the most important thing you have to do is you have to have a question in mind that you regard finding the answer to as worthwhile. Otherwise, the whole exercise is a lie. So even if you're assigned a topic, you have to find something within the topic that grips you and provides you with the motivation that's appropriate to move forward with the essay, with the attempt. And it is a lie otherwise. You're wasting your words. You're engaging in futile activity. And you're going to write something dull and terrible, and it's going to frustrate you and bore you while you're doing it. And that's because your own nervous system is telling you that you're participating in something that you have no belief in. And so, but if you're gripped by the questions, like, God, I really want to answer this question, it's like, well, you're in a perfect condition to begin to write an intelligible essay because you actually want the answer. And then the writing exercise is going to be gripping because you're grappling with a real mystery. And that's so cool. If doing that also puts you in a state where you're much more likely to learn, which makes sense, right? Because if you're doing something important and you seem to be moving forward, that's a really good time to learn. neurophysiologically that would make, or evolutionarily, that would make perfect sense.
The system, the dopaminergic system that we're talking about, anticipation and then action and reward, or in some cases, no reward, right? And the ability to persist toward a goal regardless, is a generalizable system. You had that chapter about, get your room in order, right? Get your belongings in order. This is, I think, very relevant right now. Even though it's important to have higher goals and lofty goals, the dopamine system is an incredible system because it is depletable, and yet it's also renewable, and it is self-amplifying. What I mean by that is, let's say that I'm somebody who doesn't know what I'm working toward. I don't have a specific goal or question. By completing even what seem like menial tasks, like making myself a cup of coffee, drinking it, cleaning up completely, drying the cup and putting it back in the cupboard, what happens is, even if you make that seemingly trivial goal the goal, in addition to making the kitchen look nicer, it completes a circuit. It closes the dopaminergic circuit. And when dopamine is released, and it will be, maybe not to the same extent as publishing a novel, but to some extent, dopamine amplifies our ability to think into the future, to make additional plans that are unrelated to what you just did, and it literally increases confidence and energy. Why? Well, for the following reason. We all think about caloric energy, but what most people are never taught, and if I had 10 things I could teach people, one of them would be adrenaline, epinephrine, is neural energy. It's your ability to get up and go. It's the thing that makes you jittery when you're a little nervous, but it's also what allows you to move forward, to go out for a run, to pursue any goal, cognitive or physical, etc. Epinephrine, which is also adrenaline, those are the same thing, is literally manufactured from the molecule dopamine. If you look at the biochemical cascade, dopamine is converted into adrenaline, which is the basis of all energy, all neural energy.
Right.
And so, including thinking. And so if one is not in a place of being able to set their goal on a particular lofty goal, a graduate degree, a book, et cetera, yet the way one gets to that is by completing things in their immediate environment from start to finish and closing the dopaminergic loop. You literally...
those are at least micro narratives.
That's right.
Right. So they're not integrated across a long span of time. But they're not. And so one of the things, I did write about this in my first book, particularly about putting your house in perfect order. It's like, if you're lost, one of the things you can do is look around and see what direction you could take locally, is fix something. And I used to tell my clients, this is a very good thing to know. Find something that you could do that would make things better that you would do. And there's a humility in that too, because especially if you're in a low energy state, it's like, oh my God, I don't have enough energy to make dinner. It's like, do you have enough energy to put a fork on the table? And sometimes people are so depressed that that's really all they can do. It's like, can you take a small step forward, no matter how small that is? And so I knew that adrenaline was a byproduct or down the biochemical chain from dopamine, but I didn't get the significance of that fully. So basically what you're saying is that if you implement a micro routine, even something like washing a cup and putting it back in the shelf, and that's a good thing because you have a shelf and there's cups on it, you've already decided that's an appropriate way to live, is to have coffee cups on a shelf. If you go ahead with cleaning out the cup and putting it on the shelf, then you've taken steps towards a valuable micro goal. You get a dopamine kick from that. That transforms itself into adrenaline to you. So that's partly the reason that it has an antidepressant effect.
That's right. And then you can lean into some of the more successful classes of antidepressants, again, not for everybody, are the ones of the dopaminergic, adrenalinergic variety, right? Things like bupropion, as opposed to, there's a lot of debate about SSRIs. They tap into a different system. You asked about gene expression changes. There's neuroplasticity, which is on the short scale. Completion of an even trivial task like the putting away of the cup will give you more dopamine, which gives you more adrenaline, which in this analogy of either being back on one's heels, flat-footed, or forward center of mass, regardless of where one is starting out, let's say depressed is back on one's heels, it's going to tilt you forward a little bit. Then it's a question of what you do with it. So the cognitive appraisal is critical because, again, with the prefrontal cortex being so critical in establishing which of these loops gets repeated, the cognitive appraisal is critical. I'm somebody who can get things done, even if they're small. Now, if you do the cognitive appraisal,
Or you can take another cognitive appraisal there too, which is it's small things are not small.
That's right.
For the reason that we just described. It's like you might have the cognitive appraisal that doing something local, like cleaning up your room, is small, but it's not obvious at all that that's the case. It's not that trivial to put your immediate surroundings in order. And it can easily be the stepping stone to putting things in order on a broader scale. In fact, it's probably the necessary stepping stone to do that. And so they might seem small, but they're a step ahead, and ahead is a good direction.
Absolutely.
And so they're not as small as you might think. And so you can pat yourself on the back, especially if you're depressed, a little harder than you might otherwise by saying, you say, well, this is trivial, but I did it. It's like, no, if you're moving ahead, tilting yourself forward in your metaphor, that's not small. You just keep doing that, you're going to get out of this paralyzed or retreat mode. And then God only knows what you're going to be able to do.
That's right. And I think that if people were to look at these neurological and psychological processes, because we're really talking about both, is as algorithms, right? These are algorithms that have been used by every animal. Think about the animal that's foraging for food. They go down one path, they're surprised they find food. They go down another path, they're sure they're on a scent. They are sure, and then they get nothing. Well, what happens? They learn to remember, they automatically remember everything that led to that failure. And people are very good at remembering that. But be good at remembering the things that led to successes and then ride those neurochemical waves to the next node of exploration. You're talking about exploration versus anxiety.
You can also do this with people in your environment. This is something B.F. Skinner pointed out when he was training animals. He said, you can use threat and punishment to train animals. But he said the most effective mode of training isn't that at all. You use sustained attention and reward. And so imagine that you're training a rat to climb up a ladder rung by rung and then do a little dance on the top and then climb down the other side. So what Skinner would do, his animals were hungry, by the way. They were starved to 75% of their body weight. So they were pretty dopaminergically motivated by the provision of any food. He would watch them wander around in the cage where a ladder was, let's say, a little rat monkey bar apparatus. And then when the rat would get near the ladder, he'd give it a food pellet. And so then it was soon spending a lot of time near the ladder. And now and then, while it was monkeying about, it would put one paw on the first rung. It was like food pellet. And then it would soon be doing that. And then sooner or later, it would put the next paw on and he'd reward it. And so Skinner trained pigeons to pilot guided missiles by pecking on photos in relationship to the ground they were watching. Right, so
spectacular.
He could use reward in an unbelievable. So one of the things you can do in your local environment and with yourself as well is you can watch people around you and you can see when they make small steps towards manifesting some behaviors you'd like to see a lot more of. And then you can tell them in this very differentiated, discriminatory manner, you can say, hey, look, here's the sequence of actions you just undertook. I saw that, I noted the process, and here's the delightful outcome. Good work. And man, if you do that repeatedly to people around you, and you don't want to do this in a fake or manipulative way, but if you're attentive to what people are doing that's good, and you mark that with a reward, man, you produce behavioral transformations at a rate that's just beyond belief.
I love it.
And everyone feels great about it too. Yeah, it's really a good habit, man. It's giving credit that's separating the wheat from the chaff in the truest sense. To give credit where credit is due.
Yeah, the behavior.
And you can imagine you're facilitating growth in the manner that you just described. And maybe neurological or genetic transformation. We didn't get to the gene expression part yet.
Yeah, the behaviorists like Skinner were truly brilliant. And I think one experiment that I think is worth mentioning, which is kind of speaks to the power of dopamine and why it's so vital to tap into these systems, even through menial tasks, and then to build on their self-amplifying mode so that you can take on bigger things in life, so to speak, positive goals. There's a classic experiment now that's been done in humans and in animals where you take two rats, separate cages, or you could do this with humans where they're naturalistic conditions where one of the rats or humans actually has their dopamine depleted. In humans, this happens through Parkinsonian things or the ingestion of drugs which accidentally deplete the dopaminergic neurons. And what you find is that if you give them an opportunity to experience something pleasurable, like hit a lever and get a pellet of food, or people to access some very tasty food, both people with dopamine and with very depleted dopamine, animals with dopamine or without dopamine will eat the food. they will pursue the food, but only if it's right in front of them. If you put any kind of task between a person or an animal and a reward, what you find is that a rat won't move one rat's length to press a lever to get the food. So they are able to experience pleasure, but what they are unable to do is to embark on any kind of effort to achieve that pleasure.
Right. So that's so cool. So that means that in part what the dopamine system is doing. So imagine that the purpose of the dopamine system is to elicit a satiating reward.
That's right.
Fundamentally. But then the satiating reward is something that has to be approached in steps.
That's right.
And so in order to maintain the motivation necessary to approach the satiating reward, you have to mark each of the steps with a marker of pleasure. And so the dopamine system is marking the intermediary steps. And then it's doing that to overcome the reluctance that you'd have to expend the energy in that micro routine that would otherwise be costly. But the fact that there's a net reward that's nested in the ultimate satiation.
That's right.
And parsing that out across the...
And sometimes people will experience tremendous anxiety in pursuit of their rewards. You know, the social situation or the goal or the book, or, you know, people imagine failure like crazy, as I'm sure, you know, we've all heard and seen. Critical, again, is this cognitive appraisal, this interpretation of that. If you think of that anxiety as a natural system of getting you to move, of just biasing your body toward movement, toward action, as opposed to inaction, because that's what anxiety really is. It's a bias toward action. Then you can literally reshape the whole notion of what it feels like to have elevated heart rate, maybe trembling hands, maybe flushing of the face when one is doing public speaking. You do it enough times, you get pretty comfortable. Now, there are situations in life, I should just mention, such as sleep deprivation or in particular, that tend to make this whole set of systems with prefrontal cortex and limbic stuff and ACC and insula kind of dysregulated. It makes it harder to manage. That goes without saying, right? You know, the quickest way to peel somebody apart is to sleep deprive them for 2 or 3 nights. One night, you're probably fine.
Right.
So, you know, all the basics of self-care, of good nutrition, social connection, sleep, exercise, sunlight, those still apply. I just want to mention that. I want to make sure I answer your question about gene expression and permanent changes, because I've failed to do that thus far. One of the things that is absolutely key about the dopamine system is that it has a fast component. Dopamine is released, more adrenaline, aka epinephrine, can be released, and you can, this sort of upward spiral of energy and sort of success with the occasional drops, right? I mean, nobody succeeds in every task, right? Sometimes the phone rings or the doorbell rings and you fail. Goodness, you fail to clean the cup. You come home, like, are you going to crash into a puddle of tears? No, you just clean it then and then put it away, right? Of course. But there's a slow system associated with achieving wins, even small wins. And that slow system is in the form of hormonal control that then translates to gene control. So 2 hormones in particular, testosterone and estrogen, which are present in both men and women, males and females, of course, but to varying degrees, are both secreted when the dopamine system is activated. This has to do with the relationship between dopaminergic neurons and the pituitary gland, which releases gonadotropins and luteinizing hormones, which then stimulate the testes and the ovaries, et cetera, to release the so-called sex steroid hormones. The sex steroid hormones, testosterone and estrogen, of course, are involved in reproductive biology, but they are both vitally important, provided they are in the proper ratios, for motivational biology. And for the following reason: the steroid hormones are so-called lipophilic, and they can cross from the outside of a cell through the cell membrane to actually into the nucleus of a cell and control gene expression. So when we achieve wins repeatedly, and again, this doesn't matter if you're male or female, you achieve wins repeatedly, testosterone is the molecule that eventually accesses not just cells to control their immediate physiology, but goes into the nucleus of those cells and controls their gene expression. And what it translates...
So does that mean that demotivated men are producing less testosterone?
We can say that the data show that repeated failures take testosterone levels lower than they would be otherwise. That is not to say that people with low testosterone will always fail. Those with higher testosterone will always win. But just to be clear, because you're correct, but people sometimes get hitched on this causal part. But indeed, one of the quickest ways to boost someone's testosterone is to have them achieve a win. of some sort. Now the win is translated.
Well, one of the things you do in behavior therapy constantly is you help people calibrate the zone of proximal. So imagine that's Vygotsky's term, right? And so if you're in the zone of proximal development, you're pushing your skill development one increment forward. And it's one that you can actually manage. And so if you see people who are entirely stymied, we're sort of back to the cup of coffee or the coffee cup example, you want to find something they can do locally this week that would constitute at least a micro win. And you just keep, and if you talk to someone, you say, well, why don't you try cleaning up your room? Because it's a complete catastrophic nightmare. It's a good place to start. This is often the case with people who are really demoralized and whose life is utterly chaotic. And maybe they come back later and say, well, like I had one client, he just had a child, and he didn't want to mess up this, but he was living at home. He was like 35 years old. He had a child out of wedlock by accident, but he didn't want to be a useless father. And he was very afraid he was going to be. And he had good reason to. Like, he still lived at home. He lived in his high school bedroom, and it was a complete bloody mess. He was living like a 12-year-old, a bad 12-year-old. And so I said, well, when was the last time that your carpet was vacuumed? And he said, well, sometimes my mother does it, but it's probably been months. I said, well, why don't you just bring the vacuum cleaner into the room and just vacuum your carpet? That'll be your task for this week. And I knew that was a bigger task than you might think, because he'd been in that room for like 18 years and it was a mess. And so cleaning it up at all was a big deal. He told me that he dragged that bloody vacuum cleaner into the doorway and left it 45 degrees across the doorway and then stepped over it for the whole week without actually using it. Oh my goodness. Yeah, resistance, that was resistance from a psychoanalytic perspective, because he saw the monster and was paralyzed. And so what we did was we reduced the task. I said, look, you've got some drawers in your bureau. They're probably a mess. Do you have a sock drawer? Yes. It said, clean up one half of the sock drawer this week. That's it. Just organize it. So you just keep cutting the tasks down week by week until you find the threshold for positive movement forward. And then what's cool about that too is there's a Pareto principle issue associated with it. So if you can find out where the person can start, it isn't linear progress, it's exponential progress forward. And so even if they have to start at a micro level, it doesn't really matter, because they get much better at it very, very rapidly as they accrue successes. Maybe that's because they're learning in the way that you described. Okay, so back to the gene regulation. It increases testosterone, the wins. Yeah,
so testosterones are associated wins. Winners tend to be able to win more? There's some, et cetera. But, if we want to bring this into the common world, a few years back when I started doing some public-facing education, I started getting a lot of questions, especially on YouTube, from young males about pornography and masturbation. And this becomes very relevant here. We have to remember that this dopaminergic system is generalizable to many different behaviors, right? Academic pursuits, sports pursuits, relationship pursuits. But fundamentally, it was, again, I wasn't a consultant at the design phase, but fundamentally, it's tacked into the adaptive survival behaviors. And every species, including ours, has at least two major motivations, which is to protect its young and to make more of itself, to make more young at some level. People can opt out of that. But one of the absolutely pathologic situations for any animal or human is to be able to access repeated dopamine surges without effort or any pursuit that's self-directed or directed, I should say. So for instance, cocaine, a drug which potently increases dopamine, or methamphetamine, which potently increases methamphetamine, but doesn't require any sort of adaptive action pursuit except to acquire the drug and spend money on it. No sacrifice. So what ends up happening is the circuit gets rewarded is only the drug-seeking behavior, and no other behavior will give the kind of potent dopamine release that cocaine or methamphetamine will, which is why they are so pernicious. Now, likewise, right. I'm not...
Well, plus they have that powerful reinforcing effect, right? So not only do you get that kick, but what's reinforced by the dopamine release is the behaviors that were right prior, particularly right prior to the ingestion. And if all that is the drug-taking behavior, that's all that develops.
That's right.
You build that monster inside your head.
That's right.
So I can see where you're going on the pornography front.
Right. So I was starting to get a lot of questions. I was kind of surprised. I thought, well, I'm male and, maybe that's why they feel comfortable asking. But people were saying, we're asking about pornography, and they were asking, I realized we want to, I'll just be direct about it. They were asking whether or not masturbation was bad. They were asking whether or not masturbation with ejaculation was particularly bad. And here's my stance on this. I'm a biologist and a neuroscientist, not a psychologist. But what we know for sure is that if an individual repeatedly engages in this circuitry, let's say masturbation and pornography with increasingly potent forms of stimulation that are on a screen, a couple of things happen. First of all, what's being reinforced is a high dopaminergic response to watching other people engage in sexual behavior, which is very different than being in a first-person sexual experience. Okay. So right there, that what's being reinforced is not actually any kind of improvement in communication skills. It's voyeurism. And as these questions started to come in more and more, I started to realize there was a lot of kind of undertones of people talking about fear of or experience with sexual dysfunction that clearly pornography can lead to. And here I'm specifically talking about males. I actually don't know the literature on females. So here I'm talking.
Females don't use visual pornography to the same degree.
I see.
They use literary pornography.
I see. So and then you start to think about, okay, what happens in the cascade or the arc of sexual arousal and orgasm? What happens is that initially there's a parasympathetically dominant, meaning if somebody is too stressed, they actually can't engage in sexual behavior.